Manhattan, New York, March 18, 1947. Frank Costello, the most powerful mobster in America, sat behind his mahogany desk at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, Suite 39C, the command center of an empire that generated $50 million annually through gambling, union control, and political corruption that extended from New York to Florida to Las Vegas. Costello was 56 years old, controlled 5 crime families through strategic alliances, had judges and senators on his payroll, and was known as the Prime Minister of the Underworld because he preferred negotiation to violence, strategy to bloodshed. But on this particular Tuesday morning, Costello faced a problem that money and influence couldn't solve, a decision that would violate every unwritten rule of the Italian Mafia, a choice that would shock every mobster, every politician, every law enforcement official who learned about it, and a gamble that would either cement his legendary status or destroy everything he'd built over 3 decades. If you're watching this story about the moment organized crime changed forever, drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from, and subscribe so you never miss the dark stories that shaped the American underworld. The problem had begun 6 weeks earlier, on February 4, 1947, when federal prosecutors announced they were pursuing racketeering charges against Costello's organization. 27 counts of illegal gambling operations, union corruption, and tax evasion that could send Costello to federal prison for 40 years. But the real threat wasn't the charges themselves. Costello had been indicted before, had always beaten the charges through excellent legal defense, through witnesses who mysteriously disappeared or changed their testimony. The real threat was that the lead prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney William Henderson, had explicitly stated in a press conference that this case was about sending a message. That organized crime, specifically Italian organized crime, could no longer operate with impunity in America. Henderson had said something else that every mobster understood was a direct threat. He'd said the government had learned from past failures, had learned that the way to beat the mob was to exploit the weaknesses in how they operated, their insularity, their refusal to trust outsiders, their reliance on Italian lawyers who were part of the same social networks, who could be predicted because they operated according to the same cultural rules that governed the mob itself. Henderson essentially announced he was going to use the Mafia's own ethnic solidarity against them. Frank Costello understood immediately what Henderson meant. Every top Italian mobster in America used Italian lawyers. Lawyers from the same neighborhoods, from families they'd known for generations. These lawyers were trusted because they were Italian, because they understood the culture, because they could be relied upon to maintain omertà, the code of silence. But that trust created predictability. Federal prosecutors knew these lawyers' strategies, knew their tactics, knew how they'd defend their clients because they'd seen the same approaches in dozens of previous mob trials. Costello spent 3 weeks consulting with his usual legal team, 5 Italian lawyers who'd successfully defended him in previous cases. But as they reviewed the government's case, Costello's lawyers delivered devastating news. This case was different. The evidence was stronger than in previous indictments. The witnesses were better protected. And most importantly, Henderson's strategy of predicting traditional mob legal defense was already evident. Every standard defense strategy they suggested, the government had already anticipated and prepared countermeasures for. It was like playing chess against an opponent who'd memorized every move you might make. By early March, Costello reached a conclusion that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. He needed a lawyer the government couldn't predict. A lawyer whose strategies would be genuinely unexpected. A lawyer who wasn't part of the Italian social networks Henderson had learned to exploit. But finding such a lawyer created an impossible problem. How do you trust someone outside your ethnic circle with secrets that could destroy you? The answer came on March 12, 1947, at a private dinner at Toots Shor's restaurant. Costello sat next to Judge Samuel Rothman, a corrupt New York Supreme Court justice who'd been on his payroll for 8 years. Rothman mentioned he'd recently observed the most brilliant courtroom performance in 20 years. A young Negro lawyer named Marcus Thaddeus Crane had defended a murder suspect in an unwinnable case, had torn apart the prosecution's evidence with such strategic brilliance that the jury acquitted after only 90 minutes. What fascinated Rothman was that Crane had won using strategies he'd never seen before. Legal arguments approached from completely unexpected angles, cross-examination techniques that dismantled witnesses through logic rather than intimidation. It was brilliant precisely because it was different. Frank Costello asked the question that would change organized crime history. This Negro lawyer, can he be trusted? For 4 days, Costello's people investigated Crane. What they discovered was that Marcus Crane had one defining characteristic: loyalty. When Crane took a case, he became devoted to that client regardless of personal cost. Stories of 80-hour weeks on cases paying nothing. Stories of refusing to cooperate with prosecutors, offering deals. The investigation also revealed Crane had developed deep distrust of government authority, understanding that the system was stacked against Negro defendants. The distrust meant Crane was psychologically prepared to defend someone the government considered dangerous. On March 18, 1947, Marcus Crane received a mysterious phone call. A car arrived at noon. The drive lasted 30 minutes through Manhattan in a pattern designed to prevent tracking. Finally, the car entered the Waldorf Astoria's underground garage. Crane was escorted to the 39th floor. The elevator opened into Suite 39C. And standing there was Frank Costello. Crane recognized him immediately. Everyone in New York knew Costello's face. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Costello studied Crane with intensity. Crane held that gaze without flinching. "Mr. Crane," Costello said, "thank you for coming. I assume you know who I am?" "I do," Crane replied steadily. "You're Frank Costello. You're facing federal racketeering charges that could send you to prison for 40 years. And I assume you're considering hiring me as your attorney, despite the fact that I'm a Negro and you're the boss of an Italian crime family." Costello smiled slightly. "I need a lawyer who can beat the federal government's case against me. I need someone brilliant enough to outthink prosecutors who've been studying my organization for 5 years. I need someone unpredictable. And I need someone loyal enough that when the government offers you deals, when they threaten you, you'll maintain attorney-client privilege, regardless of personal cost. In exchange, I'm offering you $50,000 as a retainer, another $100,000 if you win the case, and most importantly, the opportunity to prove that a Negro lawyer can defend the most powerful mobster in America successfully." Can you do that? The offer was extraordinary. $50,000 was more than Crane had earned in his entire 9-year legal career. But more than money, this case represented validation. Proof that a Negro lawyer could compete at the highest levels of American legal practice. "Mr. Costello," Crane said, "I have questions. First, will you allow me complete independence in developing legal strategy? Second, do you understand I won't participate in illegal activities? I'll defend you, but I won't help you continue criminal operations. And third, why me? You could hire any white lawyer in New York." Costello walked to the window overlooking Manhattan. "I'm hiring you because the government thinks they've figured out how to beat me. They know every Italian mob lawyer's strategy, so I need someone they can't predict, someone whose legal mind works differently. You're that person, not just because you're Negro, but because you're brilliant in ways that developed outside the traditional establishment. You learned at Howard instead of Harvard. You trained as a public defender, That different background means you think differently, and that's exactly what I need. As for your other questions, yes, you'll have complete independence. And yes, I understand you won't participate in illegal activities. I'm asking you to be my lawyer, not a criminal. But understand this. If you take this case, you become part of my world. The government will investigate you. Your phone will be tapped. Federal agents will pressure you to betray me. Other mobsters who disagree with my decision will make threats. Your life will become dangerous in ways you can't anticipate. Mr. Costello, Crane said firmly, I'll take your case. Not because I approve of organized crime. I'll take it because you're entitled to the best legal defense under the Constitution, and because I'm good enough to beat them. Give me 3 days to review the evidence. Frank Costello extended his hand. Marcus Crane shook it. And with that handshake, the most unlikely partnership in organized crime history began. This is the moment everything changed in the American underworld. If you're still watching, comment below what city you're from and hit subscribe. The next part of this story gets even darker. But here's what neither man knew. Prosecutor Henderson had a secret weapon, a witness he'd been keeping hidden. Someone close to Costello's organization who'd agreed to testify in exchange for immunity. The case everyone thought would be decided by legal brilliance was actually going to be decided by betrayal. Over the next 4 weeks, Crane worked 18 hours daily, reviewing thousands of pages of evidence. As he studied it, he began to see weaknesses. Small gaps in the government's narrative, witnesses whose credibility could be attacked. Most importantly, Crane identified the government's strategic mistake. Henderson had built the case around proving Costello was powerful. But power doesn't equal guilt in criminal law. If Crane could separate Costello's legitimate activities from criminal conduct, the case would collapse. But there was the mystery witness. When Crane asked Costello about it, Costello's expression changed. Something cold. I know who it is, Costello said quietly. Anthony Battaglia. My driver and bodyguard for 8 years. He got arrested on a murder charge. The government offered a deal. Testify against me, and they'd drop the charges and save his daughter who has leukemia. Tony chose his daughter over loyalty to me. I understand why. But his testimony will destroy me unless you neutralize it. Crane understood. The government had leveraged Battaglia's desperation. That desperation created vulnerability. A jury would question whether testimony given under such circumstances was reliable. The trial began May 5, 1947, in federal court in Manhattan. When Marcus Crane walked into that courtroom as Frank Costello's attorney, the reaction was electric. Audible gasps from spectators. A Negro lawyer defending a white mob boss. Photographers capturing images that would appear in every newspaper the next day. The prosecution spent 3 weeks presenting evidence. FBI agents testified about surveillance. Former associates testified about conversations. But Crane's cross-examinations were devastating. He'd identify inconsistencies, expose biases, demonstrate that circumstantial evidence could be interpreted multiple ways. Slowly, systematically, Crane dismantled the government's narrative. Then Anthony Battaglia took the stand. Henderson's direct examination lasted 6 hours over 2 days. Battaglia testified he'd personally witnessed Costello order murders, personally handled cash from illegal gambling. The testimony was detailed and credible. By the time Henderson finished, the case seemed overwhelming. And then Marcus Crane stood up to begin cross-examination. Mr. Battaglia, Crane began calmly, you worked for Mr. Costello for 8 years, correct? And he paid you well, treated you fairly. Yes, sir. You have a daughter named Mary with leukemia, who needs expensive treatment you couldn't afford, correct? Yes, sir. Battaglia was crying. 3 months ago, you were arrested for murder carrying a death sentence. The government offered to save you from execution and save your daughter's life in exchange for testifying against Frank Costello. You accepted that deal, correct? Yes, sir, Battaglia whispered. Crane stepped closer. When a man is desperate to save his daughter, when he's facing execution, when the government promises to solve all his problems if he tells them what they want to hear, how can this jury be certain the testimony you're giving is true? How can they be certain you're not just saying whatever prosecutors want you to say to secure that deal? Battaglia had no good answer. The damage was done. Over the next 2 days, Crane methodically identified inconsistencies, improbabilities, details that didn't make sense. He'd ask Battaglia to describe rooms where meetings supposedly occurred, then show descriptions didn't match actual locations. By the time Crane finished, Battaglia had been completely discredited. On June 6, 1947, the jury returned their verdict. Not guilty on all 27 counts. Before we finish, if you made it this far, drop a comment telling us what country you're watching from, and subscribe, because the stories only get darker. The courtroom erupted. A Negro lawyer had defended the most powerful white mob boss in America and had won. That evening, Costello gave Crane the $100,000 he'd promised. He also offered a permanent position. Crane declined. He'd proven what he needed, that a Negro lawyer could compete at the highest levels. That race didn't limit what he could achieve. The impact extended far beyond the verdict. Within 2 years, several crime families began quietly hiring non-Italian lawyers for difficult cases, recognizing that loyalty and competence mattered more than ethnicity. For Marcus Crane, the case changed his life. Law firms that had refused to hire him suddenly wanted to recruit him. Within 5 years, Crane had built one of the most successful criminal defense practices in New York. Frank Costello died in 1973 at age 82, never spending significant time in prison. When asked about hiring Marcus Crane, Costello's response was pragmatic. I hired the best lawyer I could find. That lawyer happened to be Negro. The government expected me to hire an Italian lawyer. I didn't give them what they expected, and I won. That's not about race. That's about being smarter than your enemies. By hiring Marcus Crane, by trusting a Negro lawyer with secrets that could have destroyed him, by winning through competence rather than ethnic solidarity, Frank Costello demonstrated that the future of organized crime belonged to pragmatists who understood success required adaptation. That lesson influenced a generation of mob bosses who understood that survival required thinking beyond narrow ethnic boundaries. That's how one trial in 1947 changed both organized crime and the American legal profession in ways that echoed for generations.